And so now I'd like to go ahead and introduce our guest speaker, David Kohling, founder and president of Strategic Dining Services, which is a dining and hospitality managed company focused in the senior living industry. David is a nationally known restaurateur and chef. He has served as Chief Operating Officer for Odyssey Cruises and consulted for high-profile restaurants and food services operations such as Michael Jordan Golf Centers, Jack Nicklaus's Winestone Country Club Development, and Peapod Grocery. Additionally, he founded highly rated restaurants, including the Greenery, Biloxi Grill, both in the suburban Chicago. So welcome, David.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it. So we're going to talk today about these two trends, which we selected really because they tend to come up on a regular basis with our clients. Questions of how, why, what should we be doing? They seem to be hot topics. So we thought these would be a great item to talk through and give you our insight and the things that we bring to our clients on these two issues. And so first, all-day dining, and then second, we'll follow up with incorporating local and fresh foods without blowing your budget, the whole farm-to-table phenomenon, and how we can incorporate that into a senior living setting. So, well, here's a quick poll. Offering more choices in dining increases resident satisfaction. So if you believe that adding more choices increases satisfaction, put true. And this would be an interesting question to talk through. I'll give you just a second.
Okay, thanks, David. We've got almost everybody voted, so we'll give it 2 more seconds and we'll go ahead and close the poll and share the results. Okay, so we have 55% at false and 45% true.
So that's a pretty interesting mix down the middle there. So generally we see operators tend to say the more choices we can provide, the better the resident is going to feel about our dining program. And it's great to see that a large percentage of you didn't bite on that little tidbit, because certainly more choices, or using a different term, a variety of menu choices is definitely an improvement and a quality enhancement for our residents. But that doesn't necessarily always prove to be true. The addition of choices can also really harm the ability to execute. And a very broad menu with many, many choices is much more difficult to execute than a narrow menu with a few choices. And the recommendation that we make to our clients is to keep menus very tight, very few choices, but make sure those menus change regularly. So the sense of variety comes from an always evolving and always changing menu, rather than a menu with 30 or 40 items, which really harms our ability to deliver quality. So back to all-day dining, the benefits and the challenges. Let's talk through what those are, and then we'll talk through some of the details of how we get there. The benefits certainly of an all-day program, I'd like to start with the marketing and sales perspective, because when I walk into a community and ask the sales team if this is an important component of what they offer and what they sell, they will always tell me that it is very important. It's one of the most important things that they offer when they're talking to a new client. It's really interesting though, because from an operations standpoint, we see very few residents take advantage of all-day dining in many of the communities that we are in. But the perception or the benefit to the potential buyer seems to be very strong. Then certainly, you know, we can solve this issue of flow into the dining room. Many of us have challenges with opening the doors at 11:30 and the herd comes rolling in. By providing an all-day experience where the dining room is always open, you really can manage that flow quite a bit better in many situations. And then also, of course, we're accomplishing what we all set out to do, which is accommodating residents' needs. We want to make sure that we provide the sorts of products that keep our residents happy and give them the flexibility and the ability to choose when and where and how they eat. On the challenges side, if you've tried this before, you probably already know some of these, but staffing, scheduling, how is this going to change our staffing models and our schedules? Certainly a cost. Is there a cost associated with all-day dining? An extra food cost? Certainly labor. We've got a dining room staff now, perhaps kitchen staff that will have to be added or not, and we'll talk about that. Product quality is certainly one of the biggest challenges. It is much more difficult to produce a single item in the middle of the afternoon from a quality perspective than it is to be prepared and execute a meal in a tighter time frame where we can have a lot of products finishing close to her at the same time. And then, of course, the operational challenge of sanitation and cleanup. How do we get a dining room cleaned the way an operator who closes it down for 2 hours or 3 hours in the afternoon? When do you do your vacuuming, table changes? And do you have a table that's left dirty because a group at 2 or 3 o'clock left and a server wasn't out there at the time, and so a table sits dirty? So there's all kinds of challenges and operational changes that we have to make when we start talking about all-day dining. So how many of you are currently offering all-day dining? It'd be interesting to know as we talk through this forward. So if you could take a few minutes and a few seconds, I'm sorry, and just respond to that, and we'll see what the group thinks about and what you're doing currently.
Great, David. We almost have everyone voted. We'll give it a few more seconds. All right, I'm going to go ahead and close the poll and share the results. So 26% said yes and 74% said no.
All right. Well, it's interesting. It is a move that requires some thought and some planning, to be sure. And those of you who are doing it now, I'm sure are approaching it in a lot of different ways. But I'll share with you our thoughts on this direction and one of the best ways we feel to manage this and to provide an all-day dining experience and stay within budget, or at least not break it entirely. So certainly things to consider when we're talking about all-day dining. Staffing. How are we going to staff it? There's nothing worse than offering a product to your residents like all-day dining, but yet they can never find anyone in the dining room, or they can't find someone to take their order. Certainly the number of dining venues is going to change your approach to all-day dining. For many clients with multiple dining venues, the smart way to go, of course, is to pick one of the venues to open in the off hours. And you know, the selection of that venue is really based on staffing and labor costs, and then the ability to execute food at a certain level. And then levels of care. Depending on what you're doing and what products and services you're providing throughout your community is going to be a big thing to figure out in terms of your ability to produce meals off typical dining times. Cost is going to be a consideration, and we'll talk a little bit about it. There is certainly a cost associated with an all-day dining approach, but I think there are ways to help keep it minimal. And then value. We really need to talk through what the value statement is for this. Is there real value? Is this something that you're adding to the residents' lives that enriches them? Is it a value point from a sales and marketing perspective? And so then is it worth the investment that we're going to talk about? And that's something you have to make on an individual level. So when we talk about staffing, the all-day dining program does require that you have to provide service staff in some setting. And I hear some operators make the assessment, listen, I've got someone here anyway, so I'm going to put them out on the floor in some role. Maybe they're there between shifts, maybe they're there doing a different role. But do remember that there is real cost, even though we talk about saying, well, I have someone there anyway. You are pulling them off of a role and a position where previously you thought you needed them. That work has to be done by someone, and so there's a real cost associated with that. So I'm going to switch back here to the previous slide that we just skipped over, but talking about the menu, and then we'll move into more detail on the staffing standpoint. The cost, the fresh approach, timing and execution, and variety in an all-day dining menu. I think the number one mistake that we see for operators is trying to provide a menu program that is identical to what they're offering throughout the day. So for instance, we have a couple of featured entrees today at lunch. Operators want to offer those same products throughout the day to their residents. And we say that that's a real mistake. Those items are geared to be served within a certain service window. If you think about a whole protein, let's say we have a whole pork loin, and we're going to slow cook that, taking 3 to 4 hours so that it's timed to come out at lunch. How is that going to play throughout the day? We're going to have to hold it. It will deteriorate. So there are a lot of items that just don't work for all-day dining. Don't try to force those into your mix. We really recommend that you take an approach that says, we're going to create an all-day menu. That's different than the specials or the menu we offer during our typical meal service times. And do remember that 98% of your residents are going to eat during those typical meal times. It's just the way we're all programmed. And so they may have all-day dining available to them, but they're not going to have the social interaction. They're not going to have the natural biological clock that they've spent years training, that I eat breakfast at this time, I eat lunch at this time, and I eat dinner at this time. It really holds true. So we really recommend that you create a menu program that is for all-day dining, but is not a part of your regular menu program. And particularly if you launch a new all-day dining program like that, you'll have no problem because there's no set expectations that it should be the same. If you're offering it now and it is the same menu, I would really encourage you to take a look at changing that. Now, there's nothing to be said that you can't offer a special that you still have is available. You served it at lunch or you're preparing it for dinner. Offering specials word of mouth is a powerful way to give the feeling of your dining room as a true restaurant experience. That's where you hear and feel that sort of service and hospitality approach. When I can come to the table and say, oh, chef has some beautiful salmon that he's working on for dinner, I can certainly ask him if we can serve that to you today, if that sounds like something you might want. It really just ups the game. But create a menu that's different so that you're not trying to mimic what you did during the lunchtime or what you're going to do during the mealtime in the evening. When we see it happen, we'll see a beautiful, as I said, slow cooked pork roast gets carved at lunch, but at 3 in the afternoon, that same product is a piece of pork that is thrown into the oven or cooked on the flat top. It's a different product, and even if they are similar in quality, which rarely they are, it's different. And so if you're gonna create a different product, let's create one that we really can lay claim to. That's a really nice product that we can do and do regularly. So with a fresh approach, which obviously we want to do, we also have to be careful when we're writing an always available menu that we have the flexibility to really offer fresh products. So we tend to stay away from designating particular vegetables, let's say. So instead we would just say with a fresh, so if we did a pan-seared pork chop with a fresh vegetable, so that we can then respond to what's in house and prepare that appropriately for the resident at the time that we're cooking it. Again, we can't hold products all day long, not if you want great quality. And think about a slow cooked brisket, a pot roast, and the timing of what that takes to execute. That isn't something we would want to now make in the morning and hold all day. Those things just need to be excluded from all day dining, so that you can prepare things to order and have a great program. The timing of execution is an interesting one, because one of the things that we see, and you've probably all experienced this yourself, if not in your own operations, in restaurants that you go to, the absolute worst service and the poorest food quality come at the slowest times. It's really interesting. You would think, look, the service staff, the restaurant's still slow, so they're available. The chefs aren't busy. The food should be great. But these are the off times when people aren't focused, aren't paying the sort of attention that we do during mealtime. When it's mealtime, it's all hands on deck. We are engaged. We are putting out great meals. Everyone is there. All the focus is on excellence and execution. When we start serving food in these off hours, we tend to get somebody who's back doing some prep work or receiving an order, so they don't maybe see the ticket come in on time, or the server who's being asked to make sure they clean up the service area, and so they don't spot the guests as they walk in. These are all really difficult issues, and why we tend to say, if you're going to do an all-day dining program, make sure the investment is there from a labor standpoint that says this is what these people are hired to do and be. They're not working out of another role and being available for this. So timing is really an interesting thing in off hours, and it's something you need to be highly aware of. Who is supposed to be on the floor? Who is taking care of that resident? Do we have an alarm system or a trigger system or a bell system that we know when anyone walks in or walks out of our service areas, so that we can be with them quickly? And then the variety of the all-day dining menu is, again, similar to the discussion that we started on earlier for general menu preparation, is that the breadth of the menu isn't as important as the variety is. So that as you produce an all-day dining menu, make sure that it's something that's a living document, that it's changing regularly, that it's changing with the seasons, it's changing just to change, so that the residents experience the variety, not through the breadth of the menu, but because every time they come in, they see something a little bit different. I'm not saying you have to change the entire menu, but if you have 6 to 8 items on an always available menu, which is a good number, 3 or 4 different proteins with soup, salad, sandwich offerings. Every time I look at it, there's going to be 1 or 2 new items on it, perhaps once a month. And then 1 or 2 items come off, maybe the least popular, or maybe the most popular, to cause a little ruckus. And then when you bring it back, people are excited to have it. But make sure you're working with seasonality, and that this is a living document that continues to evolve and grow over time. So back to the staffing considerations. Again, there is a real cost associated with providing service during all-day dining. Just make sure that it's accounted for, that we're not trying to pull off all-day dining and yet not make any accommodation from a cost of budgeting standpoint, because what you will end up with is not a very good product and not something you're going to be proud of. And if you go into an all-day dining program and know that you're set up to have a lesser quality product during those off times, then just don't do it. It's really not worth the risk. From a hospitality and service standpoint, the same thing. Make sure that you can create a hospitality environment, the same one that you provide during traditional meal periods. Is there someone there to greet a resident? If there is during your regular meal periods, you better make it consistent with that in the off periods. And then, can you develop service staff, and can you find a role for service staff in very slow and off hours? So I think this question of all-day dining is certainly one that each community has to look at and address on their own, because it's not for everyone. And when you hear the data that this is used by very, very few residents, consider offering all-day dining, but doing it in your own way. Create a way that you can provide an all-day experience without maybe the major investment, without keeping the dining room open all the time. Do you have a nook, a cranny, a coffee house, a shop? Can you provide to-go meals all day long? Can you come up with a way that what you provide is excellent and just package that in that way? I've also worked with a lot of our clients who just say to the residents, we'd be more than happy to accommodate you all day at any time. Now, the dining room is only open from 11:30 until 1 and from 5 until 7, but we will accommodate you at all times. So you're setting up an expectation that the residents know that the dining room isn't open, but we will absolutely accommodate them without question. So now the lack of service or someone there to greet them, or that they have to ring a doorbell or knock on a door or ask the concierge for a quick phone call, it is no longer a barrier, nor is it looked down upon. If we respond to it quickly and in full consideration, the residents, yes, Mr. Smith, of course we'd love to have you. Why don't you take a table over here and I'll take your order if I'm the chef. Let me get the menu for you. And also here's, by the way, I'm working on a couple of things right now that I'd be more than happy to make for you. What are you in the mood for? What sounds great? Believe me, that can be done, because the number of times that will need to be done is so small that it really creates this wonderful opportunity to show your hospitality, to make a meal specifically for a resident who did have a doctor's appointment, did have a challenge or a schedule conflict, and now we accommodate them without building a very formal all-day program. So there's a lot there, a lot of considerations, a lot of different things for each community, but it's important that you take into the realities of all of these things, the effects they're going to have on your staff, service, cost, and the quality of your hospitality experience. All right, so let's now talk about the other big topic item these days. I can hardly visit a community without talking about, farm to table, using local vendors. How can we use the seasonality of the products around us, and are we doing it? So again, let's first talk about the benefits and challenges of this approach. Certainly one of the benefits that I think is overlooked by many is just working within the community that you are located in, working with vendors who live and work and have family within your physical geographical community. These are the same people who have grandparents, have aunts, uncles, have people that are potential customers for your community. And, it's important that we build those local connections and ties. So if you're working with a broadline supplier, which of course you have to, but how can you mix that in with a local vendor to bring that local connection to your community outside the product side? Just bringing the people in, we think, is an important benefit to have within your community. Certainly, using a local vendor gives you a second resource. We're not talking here about using local vendors for 70–80% of your food requirements. But we are saying that now with a local vendor, 2, 3, 4, you now have a secondary resource to judge quality against, to judge pricing against. So it opens your eyes in terms of what's in the marketplace. Certainly then the ability to provide products that the residents may have grown up with. Local products, local brands, even local produce that they're used to getting can be very powerful to carry over with your residents. And then certainly it's a quality issue, right? Can you can you achieve higher quality by utilizing local vendors across what your broadliner will bring in the back door? And certainly this, is generally thought of about produce. Fresh fruits and vegetables are generally the challenge with many of the broadliners, but there may be some other products, and we'll talk about those. And then another point to consider too in terms of the benefits is service. Many times a local vendor is going to provide a higher quality or caliber of service than a broadliner will, not because maybe they don't want to, but they just don't have the ability, where a local vendor may often be the guy who can throw a case of lettuce into the back of his car and drive it over to you on Saturday because you forgot to order it for Friday. And many times the broadliners aren't in a position to be able to provide that sort of service. And then one of the other benefits that we talk about, particularly with smaller communities or communities during ramp up, is that local vendors many times can bring you smaller quantities of products. So your waste goes down, and you can really get the products that you want. So, and there are more, but that's kind of a checklist of some of the top benefits of working with a local vendor. Certainly on the challenge side, the first one that comes up is price. Look, hey, those local guys at local produce, it's really, really expensive. I can't afford to do that. The other part too is finding the vendors. Where do I go? How do I find a good, fish supplier? How can I find a good produce guy? And that many times is a barrier for operators, and we'll talk about that. Working around delivery schedules. Sometimes local vendors have different delivery parameters, and you might have to work around those. They may have days they can't come, but sometimes it's also a benefit. Sometimes they can come more often. And so again, you can get smaller orders with more frequency, but sometimes you have to work around their schedule. And sometimes inconsistent availability. Certainly the smaller the vendor is, the less control they have over their product line and depth of inventory. And so we'll see, availability issues many times working with local vendors. So those are the benefits, challenges of working. But we think this is a really important step. And it's a step that the restaurant world has already really taken on fully. And so as we work in senior living to compare our dining operations with restaurants, instead of comparing ourselves to other senior living operators, we really better be on board comparing what we do with what's available in our neighborhood. Because our residents are very aware of their options away from our communities. And that continues to change and build. And so we can no longer use senior living as our benchmark for quality. We need to use the competitive restaurant world as the barometer for how we're doing. And I can tell you that the competitive restaurant world is completely on board with utilizing local vendors and utilizing seasonal products when they're available. And even the chains have created formulas and ways that their local operators can work outside their distribution systems in small ways to augment their product offerings. So it's time we get on board with this and make sure that we're really living this by what we're doing day in and day out. So what to consider when we're talking about the partnerships with local vendors? Certainly cost versus price I want to spend some time on. But the biggest message I want to send today, and I think the most powerful one for those of you who maybe haven't taken this step fully and what you're going to do and how you're going to incorporate this, is that this doesn't have to be full blown. It's funny, I have a friend in the restaurant business up in Chicago who opened a Midwest restaurant, farm to table Midwest menu. And I gave him a hard time, but I said, so in January, is it just going to be canned goods and frozen products? Because that's all we have in the Midwest in January. I mean, the reality of farm to table is that it has to be practical. We have to, use it when it's available. So you can step into this process, this thought of fresh local products by merely just dipping your toe in the water, and you start to be able to tell the story. But this isn't completely revamping your menu, your approach. It's a process, but you can start it very easily by picking up one or two products that are unique to your area. Find somebody who can bring those to you, introduce them to your residents, and start talking about them. And we're going to talk about the telling the story part. But again, so this is not the type of financial commitment that's going to change whether you should be doing this or not. This is very, very tiny. So let's talk a little bit about cost versus price, because we get hung up on that a lot. And we're in communities where we'll work with dining service directors and chefs who will say, listen, I've compared some prices with this local produce company, and I compare it to my broadline pricing, and quite frankly, I just can't justify it. The prices are much higher. And so what we do then is sit down and talk about, all right, let's forget the price for a while and let's talk about the cost. And so by that, I mean, if we have a case of lettuce that comes from a broadline supplier and it's $18, and my case of the same lettuce from my local provider is $23, and I have a chef who refuses to make that change because he knows it's going to hurt him, we start talking about the real cost of that. So in that case from the broadline supplier, are you pulling off outer leaves of your lettuce? Is the quality less? Are you wasting yield? So if I'm taking off 10% of the lettuce every time I use a head, wait a minute, now the real cost of that lettuce is different than the price of that lettuce. If I'm throwing away a head or two at the end of every case, because by the time I get to them, they have deteriorated and I can no longer use them, but from my local vendor, I get to use every head in the case because he's got a couple of days of youth in that lettuce than the broadline supplier did. Now, what's the real cost? So we really need to look at quality. We need to look at yields, and then the service that they provide. Again, my example of throwing a case of lettuce in the back of the car. But there are other service components that you should really consider. And one of the things that is important with using local vendors is the title of this slide. It's partnerships with local vendors. It's creating a two-way street with vendors to where you work together to achieve your goals, and so for the best outcome for your residents and their experience. And so by that I mean creating the sort of relationship that a local vendor who goes into the market or where he picks up his produce sees a flat of Cape gooseberries that they're giving away practically because they've only got a couple more days on them, and knows that your operation will take them because they're unique and wonderful, and he's either going to give them to you for free or for $5 for a flat or whatever it costs him to provide that service, and he knows that you'll take them. You start building a partnership. You start getting those special things in the marketplace that maybe no one else would get. And now you get the chance to wow your residents with some of this product. So it really is a partnership on the service side, and you create a connection. They start understanding what you're looking for and why, and what you will take from them and what they won't, and start working together to create a success for both of you. It's win-win. So when we talk about then working with these partners, we really have to leverage these partnerships. So the important thing about what we're doing, as I said, is that you should be comfortable creeping into this. So if you're only using 2 or 3 local products, but let's say you're in South Florida and you can get local citrus. Maybe that's the only thing you're going to buy locally, but you better be telling the story about it. So we buy our citrus from the from the Grove just around the corner, just up the street from our local community. As a matter of fact, our salad dressing, the citrus vinaigrette, is made in-house. It's our signature dressing. We buy our oranges locally. That very storytelling gives the indication that that's not the only thing you buy locally. Hey, maybe it is right now, but it's starting you down the road. But telling the story is what really makes it work. There's no sense in going out and sourcing and spending the time to provide local tastes and flavors for your residents, aside from the obvious quality piece of it, without telling the story. And so you may be only using a handful of items from a local resource, but boy, they can tell a powerful story about what you're doing. From a farmer's name to the product itself. These are really important stories to tell because it says something about the rest of your dining operation, your care and consideration for your residents, that we are so invested. We sourced out this local product and we're using it in our dressing. We use it in our biscuits. We use local honey drizzled over our breakfast goods in the morning, and here's where the honey comes from. I've only named 2 or 3 products, and already you get the sense that, my gosh, look what we do, and look how we provide an experience for our residents. So when you do use these products, and let's say you pay a little bit more for them, if you're gaining the wow, then it's worth the investment. You're getting to tell a story, you create wow, and you spend a few pennies more. Hey, we can find another place to save a few pennies. But I can tell you that generally, buying local is not more expensive, particularly when it comes to produce, seafood, dairy, and other products, because many times the quality and the yield and actually their pricing is going to be competitive with what your broadliner is charging you. So really dive into these, and keep in mind too that we're not just talking about produce here. We should be looking for a lot of different opportunities from ice cream and dairy. Is there an ice cream brand that your residents grew up with that's a local product? What about a bakery or specific bread items? Seafood certainly is something you can source out, and maybe it's not every rotation on your menu, and certainly you have to use some lower cost or cost responsible seafood products. But what about once a month you're working with just a local seafood supplier for a beautiful, beautiful piece of fish, and again, you're telling the story about it. On the floor tonight, this fish just came in today. It's a beautiful fish from wherever. And how about if it's even better if it's local? If you're in the Midwest, are you using local whitefish, perch? If you're on the coast, are you using some of those species? Again, I understand not all of us can afford to use those all the time, but if you just use it once a month, you get to tell a story about it, that you're sourcing and you're working for the benefit of the resident experience, and it creates a buzz. And we know that the bulk of our menus, the bulk of what we do, is creating fabulous comfort food, the food that all of us eat every day, day in and day out. We're not looking for, a fancy dining experience every time we eat out, but you can still create wow within a comfortable, folksy, wholesome meal by telling these stories of where some of these items have been sourced. Meats, sausages, any of these things that you can find in your community that perhaps your residents grew up with and have used will really help you tell a story about what you're doing. So get a little question here. What percentage of your raw food should come from local vendors and farmers? What does everybody think the right amount should be? Let's say you're doing none now, and you want to change your game. What should it be?
Great, thanks, David. We have some folks voting. We'll give it a few more seconds. right, we're going to go ahead and close the poll. So we have most everybody said that it's about 25% of your raw food purchase should be from local. 25% of the respondents said 5%, and 20% said 50% of raw food purchase should be from local vendors.
So here's the beauty of this question. You're all right, right? Everybody got this one right because it's what works for you. And that's a really important thing to note is that you can't force yourself to say this is what we should be doing. It needs to be 30%. So that's what we're going to do, because then you will spend more money and then you will change your quality potential. What you need to do is look in the market and start working and understanding what's available and what you can buy and what is better in quality, and what the seasonal changes are and when and what things come available over time. So there is no magic number. It's what works in your market, and it's going to be different for a small community in northern Minnesota than it is for a large inner city community, than it is for a community in the southern growing states. So it will all change. It's just important that you're making a dent in it and you're working towards it. And as you do, you will find more and more opportunities to add those products to your mix and delight and engage your residents. All right, so I think we've got another poll question right behind that. It costs more to use fresh products versus prepared products. And let's just think this as cost period. Labor, food, overall, in total, it costs more to do one rather than the other. So does it cost more to use fresh than prepared? All right, it looks like overwhelming said false, so they win the prize today. That is absolutely false. If managed properly, there is no difference. We do not trade fresh product for labor. If you do, then you're handling it wrong. We can utilize the labor that we have in-house and incorporate fresh products and reduce the amount of prepared products without any additional cost. Keep in mind that we have a cost benefit on the food side, and that fresh products are more affordable than prepared products. Prepared products already have labor in them. You have to pay for that. It may be more efficient labor than yours, but you're still paying for it. It's an expense. And so if we buy a fresh product, we're starting with a food cost that is less than those same products in a fully prepared item. Now we have the labor to put those together, but generally we have the kitchen labor in the kitchen anyway, and it's a process of learning and teaching how to handle those products effectively, efficiently. And so even if you were to have a tiny blip of labor increase, you should see a corresponding tiny blip of food cost decrease. So it is not more expensive to make that change or to live and operate in that world. Now, again, you have to be smart, and there are some times when you can't use the fresh product that you wanted. And when we talk about, with our clients, order guide management and really watching food costs, the biggest contributor to a variance in food cost is that we're buying the wrong products at the wrong time of year. So be careful that when you are really buying products that you know need to be fresh, but if they're not available, if the yield is down and the price is up, avoid them. Switch, modify your menu today or this week and utilize a different product. So many times people will argue, look, I switched to fresh and it cost me a lot more. Well, yes, it will if you are rigid in your purchasing habits, but you need to become more fluid and say, look, You know, we had terrible storms on the East Coast. Has that affected any produce or products that I need to avoid this week? Because those will put me over. And maybe I can use a substitution. Maybe I have to pull a frozen product out of the freezer this week because the strawberry crop was destroyed in California, and so my hands are tied, and I'm going to make a raspberry cobbler instead, and I happen to have frozen raspberries in the freezer. Great. And there are times to utilize it, and there's times to be smart, but fresh does not equal higher cost. So specifically now with the partnership with local vendors, how to stay within your budget. So you're paying a little bit of a premium. Be practical, right? Again, you don't have to buy every single product from your local vendor. You don't have to leverage everything that you're doing just to work with that vendor. Start small, be practical. Leverage seasonality. You should be buying things in season locally. They should be throughout your menu for a couple of reasons. One, they're their best quality, absolutely. They're at their best price in season. And quite frankly, our residents are used to seeing them at that time of year. You know, if you're in the Midwest in a senior living community, you grew up eating zucchini, tomatoes, and sweet corn all summer long. It's okay that we serve it all summer long. And then when it leaves, move on to something else. Now you're into squashes and other late, early fall fruits and vegetables. So leverage that seasonality because you'll benefit from it price-wise, and you'll benefit from it from a quality perspective. And then be creative. What I mentioned before was, you can just use one local product, but using it in a creative way to really tell a story and to be in a lot of products. So I buy some local honey, and now I'm drizzling it on, many different things, on special desserts. I've got it incorporated in our bread baking. So now it's not just French bread, but it's French bread made with local honey, or I bake a honey loaf, or I drizzle it over the top of a grilled chicken breast tonight with local honey, and I get to tell a story. So just be creative, and then you can really start letting your residents know that this is what we're doing and this is how we're trying to benefit their experience. So that's my presentation. I hope you got something out of it. And if there are some questions, I think, Andrea, now would be the time to address those, if I'm correct.
That's great. Thank you so much, David. We've got a few questions that came in, and I encourage everybody to go ahead. If you have a question, go ahead and put it into the questions pane in your control panel. So the first question is, can you give an example of an all-day dining menu item?
So that's a good question, because when you start thinking about those all-day menu items, they have to be items that, from the second I get the order, I'm going to be able to make that in a reasonable amount of time. And it's something that I don't have prepared in advance so that I can't lose it. I don't have waste. And so it really takes some thinking as you go through your menu mix and the products that you have on hand all the time to come up with what maybe some of those products should be. But an example, for instance, would be, how about a seared chicken breast with basil tomato, with basil pesto and summer tomatoes, and maybe even just a dollop of cottage cheese if this is a luncheon offering. Now, when you think about those products, it's a real simple, quick answer, but a fresh chicken breast, grilled, basil pesto you have on hand and can be kept for forever. Tomatoes should be in everybody's wheelhouse and in your storeroom, not in your refrigerator, by the way. And then a little cottage cheese as a garnish, and maybe some fresh basil on that plate. And everything I've got, I can make to order. It's fresh, it's beautiful, and I have zero waste. So you have to just contemplate the timing of execution, the freshness, the availability, and then the lack of waste.
Terrific, thank you. Next question, how do you find local vendors?
Well, there's a lot of different ways, but certainly networking with other chefs, anyone else that if you're in the business, you need to be out there and learning who everybody else uses. Talk to your buddies, talk to friends that work at other places. That's a perfect starting point. But then don't be afraid to ask at restaurants. If you go to restaurants in the local community, ask who their vendors are. They'll love to tell you because you're interested. If you say, "Wow, this is so good. Where do you guys get this? Who do you use?" People are certainly open to sharing. And lastly, you should be going to, particularly this time of year, farmers markets and any type of market where you see farmers and distributors there providing product. Go network, go see what's going on there, and see if you can get any leads and find out who really does a good job in your market.
Terrific. Another question, is there an ideal number of items for an all-day menu?
So no, not really. I mean, it depends on the size and scope, but I can just tell you that it needs to be narrow. It needs to be small so that you can execute everything beautifully. And again, you're not risking a high waste level. I think, more than 10 items on an always available menu would be too many. But what's right for you? 6, 8, 9 items. 3 or 4 proteins, sandwiches, a few salads and soups. I think you're good to go.
Great. So that's all for the questions. I want to thank all the attendees and also David for this terrific presentation. And I think you have an offer to tell us about.
So there is. If anybody on the webinar would like a one-time review of your spending and purchasing habits, we would be more than happy to take a look at them and see maybe where we could offer some insight for you in terms of how to buy a little differently or maybe how to buy a little bit better. And so if anyone is interested in that, you can contact Rhonda, and her email and phone information are right there. And we'd love to help you out.
Great, terrific. Again, David, thanks so much for sharing your knowledge today with us, and we hope to have you back soon. And everyone have a great day.
Thank you.